What would it look like if Titans still existed after the end of Attack on Titan? In today's video, we're going to theorize how society might have changed on the island in a reality where Titans and modern day technology exist at the same time. Firstly though, if you haven't seen part 1 of this series, I'd strongly recommend watching that first, but for those of you that have seen it, first of all, thank you, and second of all, I'm about to do a quick recap. Alright, so part 1 began in the year 850, with Levi choosing to save Eren instead of Armin. That decision led to a series of events in which the scouts successfully attacked Marley and got their hands on 8 of the 9 Titans. The following year, an alliance led by Willy Tybur retaliated, and during this war, Zeke was killed, Historia inherited the Jaw Titan, and Eren unleashed a full-scale rumbling. Subsequently, the scouts then tried and failed to stop him, but in a twist, Eren was convinced to at least spare the lives of Eldians from across the sea. Those foreign refugees were then brought to the island, where they faced an extremely hostile reception from the natives. To fix the divide, Eren used his influence to preach a message of peace between Eldians, and died without giving his power to the military government. For Eren, that became a huge problem, since he was concerned that if foreign Eldians inherited those Titan abilities, it could lead to some kind of civil war. As a result, his government would use ruthless methods to search for the missing Titans, and while he'd eventually get 4 of them, the attack Titan would never be found. The reason for this is that it was secretly in the hands of a resistance group made up of Eldians from across the sea, including Falco and Gabi. Behind the scenes, this group was supported by Willy Tybur, who by this stage had made a deal with Premier Smith. In exchange for his release, the Tybur family agreed to use their knowledge of the world to help transform Eldia into a modern paradise. As we know, for most of the island's history, innovation had been slowed down on purpose by the king, but outside assistance did make it possible to start catching up. In this alternate timeline, the Tyburs and other foreigners would help the island progress, causing technology to drastically evolve over the next 147 years. During that time, society itself would also go through big changes, with the emergence of a new religion called Yeagerism. This religion was one based on Eren's teachings, and due to its popularity, the military government had long been replaced by the Yeagerist royal family. In the year 1005, the king was a man called Adam Reiss, whose philosophy was that Titans weren't compatible with modern day life. That's why he gave the 8 Titans to allies who he trusted would never use them, but sadly for him, one of those people was Henry Tybur. Henry's philosophy was that Titans are still the greatest power on Earth, and as head of the Tybur family, he plotted with the resistance to overthrow the king. Those plans culminated with a direct attack on the royal bloodline, which is where the first video left off. Now, finally moving on to part 2, although use of Titans was banned in this society, the Church of Eldia allowed for one specific exception. That exception states that in the unlikely event the king's life is under threat, the 4 military shifters can take action. As we know, this group contains 2 undercover resistance members in Mia and Noah, however, the remaining 2 soldiers were actually loyal to the Reiss family. In particular, the Jaw Titan was a devoted Yeagerist handpicked by the king, while the Armored was chosen mainly due to his skills in hand-to-hand combat. Despite that, compared to Henry, he was still basically a child, and the Warhammer would pummel him down the streets of Shiganshina. For anyone under the age of 70, this would be their first time ever seeing a real Titan, and across the nation there'd be a real sense of panic and also confusion. Meanwhile, in the capital city of Mitras, friends of the king would be assassinated in broad daylight by undercover resistance members. This operation was put in place by Henry as a backup plan, since he knew that if events in Shiganshina didn't play out the way he wanted, there were certain big names who could potentially give him problems. One of those names was Joy Springer, aka the female Titan, who'd be kept alive for reasons we'll see later on. Like Henry, Joy would be the head of one of Eldia's noble families and was a prominent member of Adam's government. Throughout her life, the Springers had always been closest to the royal bloodline out of the noble families, with a relationship dating back to the time of Historia. As a result, she was someone Henry had competed with for influence over the king, but from his perspective, she had one fatal flaw. That flaw was that Joy is a religious fundamentalist who belonged to an offshoot branch of Yeagerism. This branch was one that truly believed that one day Eren would return, and until that day comes, they thought it was a sin to use Titans for any reason. Because of that, Henry was super confident she wouldn't use her power, hence why the resistance just nabbed her off the street. At the same time, back in Shiganshina, the armored Titan would be outmatched and eventually torn to pieces on live TV. For now though, his life would be spared, as 2 Tybur family helicopters then shortly arrive at the scene. While that was going on, a few blocks away, Noah would stand in the rubble of a skyscraper, having exited his colossal Titan. As planned, he used his shifter to wipe out the king and his descendants, however, there were 2 people at this event he wasn't expecting to die so easily. The king's brothers, Nico and Eli Reiss, were the most recent inheritors of the Beast and Car Titans, having received their shifters 2 months ago like everyone else. Before Noah attacked the royals, he was under strict instructions to keep these 2 alive, but due to his inexperience, he ended up crushing them harder than he wanted. This resulted in Nico the Beast Titan losing his head, but luckily for Noah, Eli did barely survive. In all of the destruction, both his legs would now be missing, and as his body slowly heals, he'd look up to see the 4 titans of the Resistance standing over him. Until this point, Mia had been kept away from the fighting for strategic reasons, but once the Armored was defeated, she arrived on one of their helicopters. Crucially, with her being here, the Resistance had the founding titan and a titan of royal blood in the same location, meaning the next phase of their plan could start. By making physical contact with Eli, Mia would summon every last Eldian to the past dimension, where Henry's voice would be heard by the population. After a brief introduction, the Tybert family head would announce the king's death, but would attempt to explain what happened by telling a story about the royal bloodline. To begin, Henry would remind the masses that he'd been a close friend of the Reisses for years, but recently he discovered something that caused the situation to change. According to him, when Adam brought the Titans under his control 13 years ago, his intentions were different from what they were told. Rather than trying to protect Eldians, what the king had always truly wanted was to become a living god. For context, when Karl Fritz made his vow to renounce war, it was to prevent his descendants from fighting back against the world. However, when the outside world was then destroyed by Eren, many people theorized that the vow was now null and void. If true, it would mean that any royal who inherits the founder would have unrestricted control over the minds and bodies of everyone on the planet. Henry would claim that this ultimate power is something Adam craved, but there were 2 big obstacles in his way. Obstacle number 1 was his religion, because for decades, Yeagerist believed that it was sinful for Eldians to eat other Eldians. To get around this, he began to spread his own ideology to convince the public and the other noble houses that the Titans should be under his control. 20 years later, he succeeded when the Church of Eldia was established, but because it took so long, this led to a second problem. Unlike when he was younger, Adam now had a wife and a young adult son, and was no longer willing to accept dying to the curse of Ymir. That's why for several years he did try to give up on his dream, but in 998 he realized there might be a way around it. With the 8 titans all under his command, Adam established a research lab known as Area 13. Hidden away in the mountains of Eldia, the single goal of Area 13 was to use Titan science to somehow end the curse of Ymir. In history, no one had ever seriously tried to do this, but if successful, Adam could become an immortal god whose body would regenerate from any illness or injury. Helping him with this research were the loyal Titan shifters he'd chosen, but also hundreds of civilians who were taken against their will. Under the instruction of King Reiss, the military targeted the underground, where there was a high concentration of undocumented people. Over the years, civilians taken from here were injected with various types of fluid and torn apart to find the secrets inside Eldian DNA. Henry's story was that he only found out about this after inheriting his shifter, with the news sending him into a deep depression. From that point onwards, his life pretty much felt like a nightmare, until one night he received a message through the Warhammer Titan. In this dream, Henry saw the souls of every Warhammer throughout history, and this moment is when he was approached by Eren Yeager himself. As the savior of Eldia, Eren is viewed as a prophet by all Yeagerists, and by speaking to him, Henry would claim to have learnt many things. In particular, he'd find out that in Eren's final years, the founder saw non-stop memories of an apocalyptic future. This future is something he tried to avoid by spreading the peaceful ideals of Yeagerism. However, Adam had put humanity back on the path to extinction. According to Henry, the prophet selected him to be the one to stop this, and as proof, Eren told him to visit the tree on the hill. Sure enough, the next morning when Henry did this, he was surprised to encounter a teenager who'd also been told to come here by the prophet. The name of this young man was Hassan, who revealed that in his dream, Eren promised to return his missing power to humanity. The missing power in question was of course the Attack Titan, and the prophet chose Hassan as the vessel he wanted to inherit it. Eren's only request was that Hassan use it to fight for Eldia's freedom by helping Henry put an end to the royal bloodline. Consequently, the violent scene in Shiganshina was the result of Eren's wishes, as it was a necessary evil to avoid the future he saw. However, for Joy, all of this would feel massively wrong, because as someone that personally knew the king her whole life, Henry's story would sound ridiculous. From her standpoint, although she often disagreed with Adam about policy, she had no doubts that he was an honourable person. The idea that he'd butcher his own subjects in the hope of becoming a god, to her it didn't make any sense, but as a Yeagerist she'd have mixed emotions. Inside the church, there was a famous page in their holy book that had been interpreted in different ways by the different factions. For fundamentalists like Joy, their interpretation was that one day, the prophet would return to eradicate evil still left in the world. Considering that now in the present day, the Attack Titan has actually returned after a century, Henry's tale lines up perfectly with the religious text. That said, Joy's brain wouldn't be able to make sense of her godfather supposedly being this great evil, and so for the time being, she chose to believe in his innocence. On the flip side, around the country, most people would be stunned, but ultimately they trust Henry for a few reasons. Over the last decade, he'd spent an unbelievable amount of time crafting his public image, and the reason for this was due to the Tiber family's reputation. Thanks to Willie's role in the invasion of Eldia, the Tibers had historically been the least respected noble family, despite all the ways they benefited the island. When Henry took charge in 995, his mission was to turn this around, which is why he put into motion several plans and backup plans that could get them to the top. In the process, he gave each of his siblings important roles, with his brother Jacob being responsible for improving their image. Using his connections, Jacob constantly pulled strings to give Henry favourable coverage, portraying him as a charismatic, funny, and relatable guy who didn't act like the typical head of a noble family. Within a few years, this greatly influenced public perception to the point where Eldians of all ages, but especially young people, viewed him more favourably than the king. That perception is largely why the masses would trust him, because in the minds of Henry's supporters, a man like this wouldn't commit treason unless it was fully justified. Now, following events in Shiganshina, Henry would travel to Mitras, where resistance fighters had seized control of the royal palace. This palace is where the female and Jaw Titans were being held underground, but soon after he arrives, they'd separately be brought to see him. In Joy's case, although she wouldn't be certain of anything, her overriding suspicion was that, Adam was being set up. The sight of Henry already on the dead king's throne would help to confirm those feelings a little bit, and pretty soon the two would argue about what happened. In a nutshell, Joy would accuse him of blasphemy for his lies about the prophet, and more importantly, she'd want to know why the king's most trusted advisor would betray him. From Henry's point of view, that question would be majorly disappointing, partly because it would show his speech didn't quite have the impact he wanted. For people like Joy, the Attack Titan's return should be a life-changing miracle, so it'd come as a surprise that she'd boldly accuse him of treason. The core of the issue was that Joy held Adam in such a high regard that even though part of her wanted to believe Henry, her brain just wouldn't allow it to happen. By contrast, Henry was in the unique position of actually knowing the king's darkest secrets, and in response to Joy's question, he'd explain why he betrayed his friend. For starters, even going back to ancient times, the Tibers had always been ambitious and willing to sacrifice others for their own benefit. Here on Eldia, that mindset hadn't changed. In fact, the day Henry's father made him family head, it was on the one condition that he takes the throne. At the time, Henry figured this wouldn't be too difficult, because in theory, all the resistance had to do was get their hands on the founding titan. In the same way that Karl Fritz once used it to erase all knowledge of the world, Henry's original plan was to erase all trace of Eldia's royal and noble families. This would create a power vacuum in which the Tibers would be undisputed kings, but the plan had one glaring problem. Unlike when the first king brainwashed the island, Eldia was now in an age of information where historical data is stored on the internet, on hard drives, photos, mobile phones, and a lot more. Therefore, even if you erase people's memories, it's equally important that they don't find out what was done to them through some other source. The first king knew this, hence why he banned books about the outside world, but for Henry, the task was basically impossible. In this era, it was guaranteed that someone would find out the truth from somewhere, leading to an endless cycle of the Tibers having to crush rebellions. What Henry desired was a nation that actually wanted him to take charge, which is why he devised a completely new strategy. Improving his reputation was the first step, but more than that, he had to destroy the Reiss family's legacy. Only then would the public accept them being massacred, and so for a decade Henry laid various traps that the king was too trusting to notice. The biggest of those traps was Area 13, which was originally constructed in the days of Irvin's military government. Back then, the lab was one of several locations where they tested kids in order to find the missing titans. Gradually, it then evolved into a classified research base where the Tibers and the military worked hand in hand to play around with Titan science. Many of these experiments did involve live human subjects, and after decades of research, the brains at Area 13 came close to a major discovery. This breakthrough was a drug created from the founder's spinal fluid that, when taken in a large enough dose, allowed normal Eldians to regenerate. Compared to a real Titan, this regeneration was incredibly slow, but still, in human trials, patients regrew missing limbs and missing organs within a few weeks. Sadly, before the drug could be finalized, Area 13 and a bunch of shady labs got shut down when the Yeagerists came to power in 935. Over the next few generations, these labs were then forgotten by the royal family, until Henry intervened in the year 998. During that year, the king's brother was almost killed in an accident and was purely being kept alive by machines. For Adam, this situation was the most stressful time in his life, because although he could have healed Eli by giving him a titan, it would have involved sacrificing one of his trusted allies. The king was afraid that doing this would send a bad message, since obviously these shifters were people who he wanted to keep loyal. Sensing Adam's desperation, it was Henry who proposed the idea of opening Area 13 to complete the drug they were once painfully close to finishing. If successful, it would solve all of the king's problems, given that Eli would be able to heal without causing a rift with the Titan shifters. The only issue was that as a Yeagerist, Adam knew that the brutal methods needed to test this drug was something no person would ever willingly agree to. At the same time, Henry took advantage of the king's desperation and his love for his brother and vowed to keep the operation a secret, even from the other noble houses. This is why the king reluctantly gave permission to open the lab, not realizing his friend was working against him. Over the following 10 months that it took to finalize the drug, Henry collected hard evidence linking Adam directly to the crimes in Area 13. This evidence included emails, secret recordings, and documents that had been carefully edited to fit a certain narrative. By itself, this info could have destroyed the king years ago, but the Tybers had to stay patient for a couple reasons. Reason one was that until very recently, if Adam had been exposed, it's possible he'd be desperate enough to try and fix things with the founding Titan. That was a scenario Henry didn't even want to risk, and so the resistance held off on making any big moves until the founder was under their control. Reason number two was the existence of the king's son, because even if they did get rid of Adam years ago, the throne would have simply passed to him. Therefore, what the Tybers needed was to completely destroy the line of succession, but like I said earlier, the public wouldn't just accept that without a valid reason. To put it another way, the people had to believe the Reisses somehow deserved it, and this is where the church came in. On the island, roughly 70% of Eldians belonged to some branch of Yeagerism, and if that audience could be convinced their prophet wanted this, then whoever did it would become heroes. This is why Henry spent years building up his reputation inside the church, and provided the masses with a story that lines up with the religious text, and a miracle that would satisfy any doubters. With those three things combined, even his biggest skeptics would start to believe, hence why Joy's reaction was disappointing. Now, from her point of view, after hearing all of that, she'd feel physically sick, especially at how Adam had been manipulated in his time of grief. Still, in this moment, Joy would wonder why Henry was being so upfront about his crimes, and this is when he'd give her an ultimatum. Earlier I mentioned how the Springers were closest to the royal bloodline, and by default that made them the most influential noble house. If Joy was to publicly support Henry's ascension to the throne, then the other noble families would fall in line, and originally when she walked in here, he didn't think this would be a problem. However, once it became clear she didn't believe his lies, he basically decided to play a game. Knowing everything she knows now, Henry would offer her a position in his new government in exchange for her endorsing him and supporting his allegations against the former king. On the other hand, if she refused, every one of Eldia's noble families would be wiped out to prevent any type of rebellion. In that sense, Joy was given an impossible choice. She could either save herself by helping the devil rise to power, or she could stick to her beliefs, but in the process cause everyone she loves to die. The fact Henry would even make that proposal would show her once again what type of person he is, and it'd make it easier for her to choose. As a fundamentalist, Joy's beliefs meant more to her than most people would understand, and in good conscience she couldn't support someone who'd made such a mockery of their religion. Beyond that, her principles would never allow her to support the crown being stolen, hence why she'd spit towards Henry in a final act of defiance. Following this, Joy would get beaten unconscious by Mia, who'd been standing on the platform below the throne this entire time. For a bit of context here, Mia had been a resistance member literally her entire life, having descended from some of the group's original founders. As a result, she'd been raised to believe that the Tybers were the rightful royal family, and felt blessed to have been Henry's chosen candidate to inherit the founder. That's why, on a personal level, she just wouldn't see the funny side to Joy's disrespect, and after a quick beatdown, the female Titan would be dragged away by the guards. Flashing forward to later that night, Henry would address the nation on live TV to reveal more evidence supporting his claims. In particular, he'd present classified files from Area 13 detailing the king's approval for Eldians to be butchered as test subjects. Many of these files would be heavily redacted though, given that firstly the Tybers would want to hide their own involvement, and secondly, they didn't want the public to know Adam's real motivations. For Henry, it was crucial that people thought the king did all this for egotistical reasons, rather than the truth, which is that he was just a desperate man trying to save his brother. In this way, history would remember Adam as a villain similar to Karl Fritz, and would view this moment as the day he was rightfully overthrown. Naturally, the next question then becomes who exactly is going to replace him, and this is when Henry would unveil the 9 freedoms. Crafted by the Warhammer Titan, this tablet contained 9 supreme laws that would serve as the foundation of a new society. According to Henry, it was the prophet himself who gave him these freedoms as a way of securing Eldia's future safety. Freedom number 1 was that the Tybers would inherit the mantle of royal family, with Henry being crowned only a week after Adam's death. In the eyes of the church, which by now had removed anyone who opposed him, the Tybers were legitimately the rulers of Eldia, and gained all of the land and the wealth that previously belonged to the Reisses. On top of that, following what happened with Joy, all of the existing noble bloodlines would get wiped out in one way or another, and replaced by Henry's most loyal followers. These same followers would also form a part of his new government, where they'd advise the king in addition to having their own responsibilities. In Hassan's case, at the age of only 17, Henry would put him in charge of a task force whose single job was to re-establish the Scouts. For context, when Eren completed the Rumbling 150 years ago, the Survey Corps were effectively shut down and merged into a new organization. The main focus of that new group was to prevent a civil war, given that there were such large divisions between native and foreign Eldians. Since then, the Scouts had never returned, with travel outside the island being forbidden by the Reiss family. Their reason for doing this was purely religious, because Yeagerist viewed the Rumbling as a holy event in which Eren did terrible things in order to give them this paradise. Therefore, the idea of wanting to leave paradise was seen as a direct insult to the prophet, but this began to change when Henry unveiled the 9 freedoms. Freedom number 2 was that mankind was now free to explore the world, which for Hassan had always been his aspiration. From a young age, Hassan's mother had always told him stories about their original homeland, and his desire to see this place is why he initially joined the resistance. After proving his value, Henry then chose him to be the next attack titan, with the promise that he'd be the first one to step foot outside the island. That's why it'd now be his job to recruit a whole new generation of scouts, and by the year 1007, the process would finally be over. As commander, Hassan had planned a 10-month expedition where the Survey Corps planned to study the ruins of Mali and the ruins of the Middle East. Long term, their ultimate goal was to find suitable locations to establish a new colony, which is something the king had personally requested. Unlike his father, Henry's wish was for the Tybers to control more than just one tiny island. What he envisioned was a global empire that surpassed anything his ancestors had achieved. Establishing new colonies would be the first step towards this dream, but the king knew that not much of it would be finished during his lifetime. Although he had various labs working to find a cure for the Curse of Ymir, Henry had accepted the likely outcome, which is that he only had 11 years remaining. During that time, he wanted to lay the groundwork for his successor, so that humanity would keep expanding even after he was gone. Speaking of his successor, to understand who that might be, we need to flash back to the year 995. At that time, Henry had given important roles to each of his siblings, with his sister Hannah being instructed to cozy up to the royals. The purpose of her mission was initially just to gather info about the Reisses, but one thing that became clear very early on was that Adam was infatuated by her. Despite having a wife of over 20 years, meeting Hannah was one of the few times he'd ever felt tempted by another woman. When Henry heard about this, he viewed it as a golden opportunity for so many reasons, and pressured his sister to take things further. As a direct result of his influence, 1 year later, Hannah gave birth to a pair of twins named Rex and Willie Tiber II. These boys were the first Tybers in history to ever have royal blood, and Henry used their existence to become the king's most trusted advisor. For obvious reasons, Adam wanted to keep his distance from the twins, but it was Henry who approached the king, vowing to protect his secret and raise Rex and Willie himself. That moment was how he first earned Adam's trust, and as the boys grew up, they weren't told anything about their father's real identity. However, when Henry stole the throne, he understood that for the Tiber dynasty to last forever, his successors had to know about their greatest weapon. This great weapon was of course the founding titan, which could only be used to its full potential by either Rex or Willie II. As long as they or their descendants have control over it, then the Tybers would continue to rule humanity, no matter how advanced the world might become. That's why it was important for the twins to know about their royal-blooded heritage, with Henry planning to tell them the day they turned 18. In the year 1007 though, the boys were only 11 years old and were invited as special guests to the first ever Titan Games. These games were designed by the king as a way to normalize Titan powers, following decades of them effectively being hidden away. With the exception of Hassan, who was away on his expedition, Henry's allies would compete in a series of contests, including one-on-one battles. Across the island, over 1 million people would tune in to watch this, and while Eldia was distracted, something else would be happening in the Forest of Giant Trees. This forest is where one of Erwin's labs had been abandoned for generations, but was secretly reopened after the new king took charge. On the day of the Titan Games, this lab would be surrounded by a group of fundamentalists who'd arrived to rescue their missing comrade. That comrade was Joy, who was now the last surviving member of her house, having been kept alive as a test subject since the day she confronted the king. With that said, my friends, that is where this video ends, and once again, I want to thank you for watching all the way, and I want to thank you for all of your comments on the first video, because initially I wasn't planning to make a part 2 to this, but after seeing all of your comments, saying how much you liked it, I felt it would be cruel of me not to do another part, so I hope you enjoyed this one, and as always, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and don't be afraid to leave a comment or leave a like, as it does help out the channel. Until the next one, peace out.